Hello, my name is Claudia Castruita, and I will be rather guiding you through the November 2012 midterm, first part. So let's get started. So this is a pretty straightforward problem. Has to do, it's a strategic form game with three players. Very, very straightforward. We're going to be looking at how to set the game up, how to find pure strategy any. Taking a different look. Again, still setting up a strategic form game, just in our different circumstances. We're gonna do a little bit of iterative elimination, and again, find some pure strategy NE. So let's get started. Context of the question. Anne, Betty, and Cindy are sisters who win a free ticket to Paris. Fortunately, ticket is just for two people. Each person names the sister they want to go with. The two names match, they go to Paris together. If the person who doesn't match stays home. If nobody matches, their parents are going to go and the sisters all stay home. Sisters don't really care who they go with. Each sister just wants to go to Paris and does not want to stay home. Payoffs, if they go to Paris, 1. If they don't, or if they stay home, 0. So let's get started. So if Anne wants to go with Betty and Betty wants to go with Anne, they each get a payoff of 1. They match, they're going to Paris. Cindy, however, said Anne, she'd like to go with Anne, but Anne didn't want to go with Cindy. So Cindy gets a payoff of 0. Here, Anne says, I want to go with Betty. Betty says, I want to go with Cindy. Cindy says, I want to go with Anne. None of their names match. None of them go to Paris. Here, Anne says, I want to go with Cindy. Cindy says, I want to go with Anne. They're heading off to Paris. Betty, however, is not. She didn't match. She's staying home. Here, Anne says, I want to go with Cindy. Betty says, I want to go with Cindy. But Cindy says, I want to go with Anne. So, again, Anne goes, Betty stays, Anne goes to Paris. Anne and Cindy both go to Paris. Betty just stays home, which sucks. And over here, Betty wants to go with Anne. Anne wants to go to Betty. They're jetting off to Paris. Cindy, although she said she wanted to go with Betty, stays home. Betty wants to go with Cindy. Anne wants to go with Betty, but Cindy wants to go with Betty. Because Betty and Cindy want to go with each other, Anne does not get to go to Paris, stays home while their two sisters go. Cindy and Anne and Betty. Okay. Anne wants to go with Cindy. Cindy wants to go with Betty. Betty wants to go with Anne. None of them can match. They say, we are staying home. Anne wants to go with Cindy. Betty wants to go with Cindy. Who does Cindy want to go with? Betty. Anne stays home. Betty and Cindy go off to Paris. So, pretty straightforward strategic form game. The difference between the two boxes are to be able to illustrate Cindy's two options. When you have 3 players and they have 2 options, this is the best way to go for a strategic form game. It's pretty simple. Really the only thing that ever changes are your third values. Oh, wait, I lied to you. Scratch that. But either way, it's very, very simple. Because it just allows you to, better visualize the payoffs of these options and to not try to put them all in one chart and you're messing up. Just separate them. This is all one game. This just makes it easier for everybody to distinguish the payoffs of the actions. So now we're going to find our pure strategy Nash equilibria. And just to reiterate how to find a pure strategy any, you just want to pay attention to the best payoffs from the actions that players go through. So in this instance, first let's take a look at Anne. So we're gonna look at Anne's best payoffs when Betty wants to go with Anne. So when this is what's on the plate, or what's on the table, what are Anne's best options? So it doesn't change. Anne's best payoffs are both 1. So you highlight both of them. Here, Betty wants to go with Anne. What's Anne's best option? 1, because 1 is better than 0. Or 1 is greater than 0. What happens when Betty wants to go with Cindy? What's Anne's best option? Well, here, she should pick Cindy. And here, doesn't matter. They're both tied. Both of those go into the pot. So now let's take a look at Betty. When Anne picks Betty, what is Betty's best option? 1 or 0? 0 or 0? Tied. 1 or 1? When Betty wants to go, when Anne wants to go. Cindy, 1, 1. And when Anne wants to go with, that's when Anne wants to go with Betty. And when Anne wants to go with Cindy, what are Betty's best options? Go with Cindy. Here. We're gonna take a look at this value versus this value, this value versus this value, this versus this, and this versus that. So we're gonna get 0 versus 0. Oh, they're both tied. 1 versus 0. 1. 1 versus 1. Tied. 0 versus 1. 1. So your pure strategy, NE, are B for Betty, A, so pure strategy, NE, B, A, sorry, C, A, C, or no, sorry, C, A, C, A, C, C, A, C, C, A, and these letters correlate too. So this would be Anne, this would be Betty, and this would be Cindy. So Nash equilibrium when Anne picks Betty, and Betty picks Anne, and Cindy picks Anne. Same thing for these. Over here, B, A, B, B, A, B, B, C, B, B, C, B, and C, C, B, C, C, B. These are your pure strategy, NE. Again, very straightforward, very simple. Now we're gonna take a look at same thing as part A, but instead we're gonna take a look at a new situation. So now assume that Anne does not want to go to Paris with Betty. Anne thinks Betty will only go shopping and not want to experience Paris for its culture. So Anne would rather stay at home than go to Paris with Betty. But that does not mean Anne wants to stay home. She'd rather go to Paris with Cindy. Betty, however, doesn't want to go to Paris with Cindy. Betty thinks Cindy's picky, doesn't want to go. So Betty would rather stay at home than go to Paris with Cindy. But again, that does not mean that she doesn't want to go to Paris overall. So Betty would prefer going to Paris with Anne, even though Anne doesn't want to go to Paris with Betty. Cindy, she doesn't really care. She cares about her parents. For her, the best thing is that her parents get the ticket and they're able to enjoy the trip together. Cindy prefers staying home over going to Paris at all. She goes to Paris. She doesn't care if she goes with Anne or Betty. Doesn't matter to her. For the payoffs this time, we're going to be using 1 for the best, 0 for the second best, and -1 for the worst possible outcome. So, let's say Anne is going with Betty and Betty going with Anne. Anne does not want to go with Betty. That is the worst thing for her. Oh. Betty does want to go with Anne. That's the best thing for her. Cindy doesn't go. That is the second best thing. So now, take a look at this one. Betty wants to go. Anne is going with Betty, but Betty's going with Cindy, but Cindy's going with Anne. These two aren't going, because again, they would rather stay home than go to Paris with each other. So they're not going. It's not the worst thing, but they're not going. So it's the second best. Cindy, however, parents get to go. Best thing for her. Here, Anne wants to go with Cindy. Betty wants to go with Anne. Cindy wants to go with Anne. So, Cindy would rather go to Paris. Andy would rather go to Paris with Cindy. So, Anne, best thing for her. Betty, not the worst. Stays home, second best. Cindy, however, has to go. Doesn't stay at home. Neither do her parents go. Worst thing for her. And here, Anne goes with Cindy. Anne wants to go with Cindy, but Betty wants to go with Cindy. But Cindy wants to go with Anne. Anne gets to go. Betty doesn't go. Not the worst thing for her, though. And again, Cindy does not get to stay home. Neither do her parents get to go. So, worst thing for her. Over here, Betty wants to go with Anne. Anne wants to go with Betty. Worst thing for Anne. Not the worst thing for Betty. Betty actually wants to go with Anne. Second best thing for Cindy. Parents don't go, but she gets to stay home with them. Anne and Betty. Betty and Cindy. Cindy and Betty. Here, Anne doesn't go. But it's not the worst thing, again. Betty goes with Cindy. Didn't want to do that. Worst thing. And Cindy is going, and neither are her parents staying home. Or neither are her parents going. She's not staying home. Cindy and Anne and Betty. Cindy and Betty. None of them go. But that's the best thing for Cindy. And Cindy wants to go with Betty. Anne wants to go with Cindy. Betty wants to go with Cindy. Anne doesn't go. Not worst thing for her. Not the worst thing for her. Betty and Cindy. Betty does want to go. But I'm sorry. Betty doesn't want to go with Cindy. That's the worst thing for her. Betty going to Paris. Parents don't get to go. Worst thing for her. So now we're gonna do some iterative elimination. Just gonna copy this little chart. Oh, I'm just gonna try to make it smaller. Okay, well, no, sorry. This hates me. Okay, awesome. Reminder, iterative elimination. You're taking a look at what strategies dominate other strategies and whether they dominate them strongly or weakly. A weakly dominated strategy, payoffs tend to tie between two strategies, and a strongly dominated strategy, all strategies payoffs are greater than the opposing strategies payoffs. Oh, missed a number there. What was that? Betty wants to go with Anne. No, Anne wants to go with Betty. Betty wants to go with Cindy. Neither of them go. Best thing for Cindy. Okay. So, let's take a look. Okay. If I'm